Hi, I'm Carter Matushek. I'm going into the second year of IB English. And I'm going to be, this is my summer oral. So I'll be comparing Self-Portrait with Crow by William Arkilla to War Among People, as well as Consolation by Wisława Szymborski to War and Terrorism. So, just a general overview of both poems. The first one, Self-Portrait with Crow by William Arkilla. The poem really talks about how other countries aren't that safe. William Arkilla talks about how every day he clocks into work. And every day when he clocks in, he knows people are dying and suffering. And no matter whenever he goes to work, he knows people are being dragged into these wars that they don't want to be dragged into, and civilians are dying. That also talks about how in the U.S., because he was a El Salvadorian immigrant to the U.S., and he talks about how he just goes to work every day and nobody worries about it, nobody cares about it because they weren't there, they didn't live through it. And he watches TV and tries to stay updated, and it's just force-fed bad news every day. And one day he turns off the TV, he stops looking at the news, and just stops to reflect out the window. He sees a crow, and the crow kind of symbolizes his change and how he wants to make himself a better person. That's just a quick overview of the poem. Consolation by Wisława Szymborska. It talks about how Charles Darwin, he only liked to read stories with happier endings. There was a myth going on about that, how if he read any story with a bad ending, he would throw the book in the fire. Whether or not that's true, I'm not sure. But it's a reference to how some people will blind themselves. So it talks about how he's seen enough death and destruction of species that Charles Darwin will, he deserves to only read books with happy endings. And this is kind of just a reference to how people don't really care about issues and will be blind to issues throughout the world as long as those issues are not affecting them. Because they don't want to see the bad thing part of life because it's scary, it has consequences, and it doesn't affect them directly, so they don't want to see it because they know the outcome will be bad. Really, when you break it down into what it's talking about, the poem Consolation is really about how people are struggling in the world and they're not receiving help because people don't want to get involved and get to dirty work that might in the future lead to violence or war, even though there's already war and violence going on. Okay. And there's a couple literary devices that we can use in either poem to kind of show this point. In Self-Portrait with Crow, William Arkilla, the crow represents how the speaker is going to change. When the speaker kind of looks out the window to reflect on the crow, he really compares himself to the crow in different ways, and when he sees himself through the reflection of the beak of the crow, the speaker really talks about how he needs to better himself in order to better his community. Because people are just saying, wow, we need to better these different countries, but they're not taking any steps towards doing it because there's so much wrong with the world and so much wrong with so many different countries that they can't do it all. And they need to sit down and change themselves first before they can change the rest of the world. Okay? He just wants to sit down and acknowledge that there's bad things happening and that he can't really do much to save everything, but maybe he can change himself and change a couple of the smaller issues in the world, and people might follow him with doing that. Secondly, in Self-Portrait with Crow, the TV represents the negativity in the world, and it's the thing that's bringing a lot of people down. It's kind of what William Arkilla wants to stop everybody from doing, is stop watching the TV, because it's force-feeding bad news all the time. So next, in Consolation, Wisława Szymborska gives a list of happy endings that Charles Darwin's always liked to read, like how Fido would always come back in the last chapter, or how the families we're no longer enemies because they made up. And it's a little bit sarcastic. There's a little bit of sarcasm in that description, purely because not everything's gonna be a happy ending. And she's like, well, magically the families are friends again, and now Fido came back to home after running away in the first chapter. It's just sarcastic. We can kind of pick that up from some of her past poems. Doing a little bit of research, she talks about war and terrorism, and just general mistreatment of people, and people blinding themselves often to bad things that are happening because they don't want to deal with it. I'll talk about that a little bit later as to why she does that, but that's a general theme in a lot of her poems. So you can see she's taught by giving all these happy endings, she's kind of talking about how she wants people to stop blinding themselves to bad things, and how she wants them to open up. Okay. So a little bit of background on the authors. William Archila, he's a Salvadorian immigrant who moved to the USA when he was younger. He was born in the late 60s, which of course means he grew up as the El Salvadorian Civil War started. And that's why they immigrated to the U.S. to escape the violence and war and terrorism of that Civil War. Well, one of the biggest things you see in a lot of his poems is that he talks about the bloodshed and the fighting in the streets and the suicide bombings of the war. And even in Self Portrait with Crow, you see he talks about the man who walks into a cafe with a belly in his bomb, or a bomb in his belly, my bad, and how he was planning on blowing up. You can just see a lot of his poetry revolves around what he experienced when he was younger, which was war, terrorism, fighting, death in the streets, things like that. Now, Wisława Szymborska is a Polish poet. She writes a lot about atrocities of war. She was born in the 1920s, so she grew up during World War II in Poland. If you know anything about World War II, it was not a good time for Poland as a country and as people. A lot of them were forced into labor camps. Luckily, Wisława Szymborska was not. But she did grow up witnessing and seeing all of this around her, which led her in the future to write a little bit about how all of this how it affects people. One of the biggest examples I have of that from the time period when she grew up was the Nazis were kind of turning a blind eye to what was happening to the Jewish and non-Aryan people who were being murdered in concentration camps, because they didn't want to stand up and face the consequence of the Nazi party by speaking out against it. So that's a downside to turning a blind eye to bad things, that because the Nazis weren't being killed, so they just turned a blind eye, and as a result, millions of other people were killed. Okay, so a little bit about what the poems mean and how they kind of connect. Self-Portrait with Crow, the biggest thing overall is that people that are suffering and watching the news does not make it better, and they need to change. And people who watch the news and realize the world's bad and want to do something about it need to change themselves before they can change the world. In general, people can make themselves a lot better if they just worked on themselves instead of following mainstream media and acknowledging, look, there's all these atrocities happening all over the world, but I can't go in and fight 20 wars at the same time. Acknowledge that there's these things happening in the world. Acknowledge you wish they didn't happen, but they do, and try and change yourself and try and change your communities to help better the world in general, because that might have an effect, ripple down, and might end up changing something slowly. Consolation by Wisława Szymborska. People need to listen to both sad and happy things in life. If not, bad things can happen. You might be bound to repeat history. You might be bound to repeat a big issue that happened. If you only read what was happy, you won't know how to avoid the bad outcomes. Also, people might be blinded and think, oh, only happy things will happen no matter what I do. That's a big issue with blinding yourself to bad things, to bad situations, bad scenarios. You won't know how to react. So in conclusion, both Szymborska and our Archaea were use their poetry and poems to talk about how blinding yourself and ignoring wars is not the way to solve them. The way to solve them is to better yourself, make yourself more knowledgeable about war and the history and what's happening, so that you don't start one yourself, so that people can avoid getting into these major conflicts that really harm everyone, that harm lots of people, instead of learning from others' mistakes and not repeating them.